Welcome to Silent Outcome. Here is our story for today. He didn't raise his voice. There was no anger, no harsh words, just a quiet finality in his tone. "I'm letting you go," Mark said, his eyes not quite meeting mine. The office felt colder than usual. Jenna sat silently in the corner, watching. Her presence was like a shadow, shifting the air without a word. I folded my hands on the desk, staring at the thin file he slid across to me. No explanation followed, no room for discussion. Outside, the hum of the city carried on as if nothing had changed. But in that room, time stalled. I stood slowly, packed my things with practiced calm. The world I'd built over 5 years unraveled without a sound, like a thread pulled loose. He glanced at Jenna, then back at me. It was clear this wasn't about work. It was a performance, a silent message meant for someone else. And just like that, I was out. I joined the company nearly 5 years before that quiet day when Mark let me go. Back then, it was little more than a handful of people working out of a cramped, rented office on the edge of the city. The kind of place where everyone wore multiple hats and the hours bled into each other. I was brought in as a project manager, someone who could keep the scattered parts moving forward, connecting clients, deadlines, and teams that barely existed yet. At first, the work was tough. Resources were thin, pay was modest, and the future was uncertain. But there was something in the air, a shared belief that this company was more than just a job. Mark had a vision, clear and stubborn, and for a long time we all bought into it. We weren't just coworkers, we were a small unit trying to build something meaningful, a foundation we could be proud of. In those early years, the trust between Mark and me was simple but solid. He was a leader, yes, but he counted on me to execute plans, to keep things running smoothly when he was distracted or out negotiating deals. I was the steady presence behind the scenes, the person who connected the dots. It wasn't a glamorous role, but it was vital, and I took it seriously. We had long talks about where the company was headed, the challenges we'd face, and the sacrifices we'd have to make. I believed in the mission and in Mark's ability to get us there. We celebrated small wins together, the first major client, the first profitable quarter, the times we pulled through crises that should have broken us. There was camaraderie, the kind that only forms when people share struggle and hope in equal measure. I knew the names of everyone on the team, their strengths and weaknesses. We pushed each other quietly, without drama, with an unspoken understanding that we were all in this for the long haul. During those years, Jenna was barely a presence. Mark mentioned her in passing at first, a girlfriend, someone outside the company. For months, she remained just that, an outsider. I never met her, and she never crossed the threshold of our workspace. It didn't feel relevant. Our focus was the company, the work, the growth. Jenna was in the background, a detail not worth much thought. But even then, the stakes were clear for me. This wasn't just a paycheck. It was a career. It was stability in a world where stability was rare. It was the hope of building something lasting, something I could look back on and know I'd helped create. I had invested time, energy, and trust in this company. I'd sacrificed nights, weekends, and sometimes family plans. The work wasn't easy, but it was mine. The role demanded a kind of quiet dedication. There was no room for mistakes when clients depended on us, and when every decision could tip the balance between growth and failure. I carried that responsibility without complaint. I kept the wheels turning even when I was exhausted, and Mark noticed, or so I thought. We had a rhythm, a mutual understanding that I would manage the details and he would steer the bigger ship. The company's growth reflected that. From the cramped office, we moved into a larger space. New hires came in. The projects became more complex, the clients more demanding. I adapted, learned, and grew with the company. There were challenges, of course, moments when Mark's decisions puzzled me, or when I felt sidelined in meetings. But those moments were rare, and I pushed them aside, focusing instead on the bigger picture. I trusted Mark's leadership, and for the most part, it paid off. The company's trajectory was upward, steady, if not spectacular. I didn't question much. I believed that loyalty and competence would carry weight in the long run. I thought that years of dedication, of being the dependable one, would earn me a place at the table when it mattered most. That belief also shaped how I saw Jenna. Since she was outside the company, she wasn't part of the daily calculations. I didn't consider her influence significant. She was just a detail in Mark's personal life, not a factor in the professional. At least, that's what I told myself. But in truth, the lines between personal and professional were already beginning to blur, even if I hadn't noticed. Jenna's presence, once a mere footnote, was about to reshape everything. For now, though, the company was my world, the work was my anchor, and I was certain the trust I'd built would hold steady. This was more than a job. It was a piece of my identity, a foundation for my future. I had every reason to believe the relationship I had with Mark and with the company was solid, that the path ahead was one of growth and shared success. That made what came next all the more unexpected. The first time I noticed something was off, Jenna was barely in the room. She'd come to the office once or twice, just for a quick visit, and I barely gave it a second thought. But those visits grew more frequent. She began showing up during meetings, not as a silent observer, but as someone Mark actively listens to. I remember sitting across from him at one of those meetings, watching how he glanced at her before responding to a question I'd raised. It was subtle but unmistakable. Before, our discussions had been straightforward, grounded in the work. Now, Jenna's opinions started to weigh in, often without the context or experience to back them up. I recall one meeting where we were deciding how to allocate resources for a new project. I laid out the numbers, timelines, and risks as I always did. Jenna, who had no background in the specifics, suggested a course of action based on what seemed like a personal preference rather than strategic sense. Mark nodded thoughtfully at her input and moved the conversation in that direction. I spoke up, carefully explaining why that plan carried significant risks. Mark's attention drifted. He waved my concerns away with a distracted smile. It wasn't the Mark I'd worked with. Steady, methodical, attentive. There was a softness to his demeanor that wasn't there before. I said nothing else, not wanting to cause a scene. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. The office itself began to change in small ways. Jenna's presence became more permanent. She'd linger near Mark's desk, sometimes joining in formal chats or sharing lunch with the team. People started to treat her differently, sensing that her influence was growing. I noticed colleagues casting furtive glances, whispering just out of earshot. I kept my focus on the work, but the atmosphere was shifting. Mark's behavior was no longer consistent. There were days when he seemed distracted, preoccupied with his phone or distant conversations. Other times he pushed forward with decisions that didn't make sense to me, disregarding data or expert advice. When I questioned these choices, he responded curtly or simply changed the subject. I remember one particular morning when I approached him with concerns about an upcoming client deadline. Jenna was there, sitting quietly nearby. Mark barely looked up as I explained the risks and the potential fallout if we didn't adjust our timeline. Instead of engaging, he turns to Jenna and asked what she thought. She gave a vague answer about keeping things light and optimistic. Mark smiled and said, "Let's do it her way." It felt like the ground was shifting beneath me, but I said nothing. I didn't raise my voice or confront them. I held back the frustration that bubbled quietly inside. Instead, I focused on keeping the projects moving, trying to adapt to the new dynamic. There were moments when I caught myself doubting my own judgment. Was I overreacting? Was this just a temporary phase? Mark had always been impulsive at times, but he'd never disregarded the core needs of the business before. Still, I tried to trust the foundation we'd built, even as it wavered. The tension was never spoken aloud. No one called meetings to address changes. No confrontations broke out. The shift was gradual, almost imperceptible, but it was there, woven into the fabric of daily life. One afternoon, I overheard Jenna on the phone, speaking with someone about company matters she shouldn't have been involved with. It was indirect, casual, but it confirmed what I'd suspected. She was becoming more than just an outsider. Her influence was real and growing. I mentioned it to Mark later, carefully and without accusation. He shrugged it off, saying she was just helping out. But the look in his eyes was different, less certain, more conflicted. I began to notice how decisions once made collaboratively were now more like declarations. Mark and Jenna would confer privately, then announce a new direction. Feedback was discouraged, or at best ignored. The team's morale shifted accordingly. People became quieter, less willing to push back. Despite all this, I stayed focused on my role. I kept tracking deadlines, managing clients, and trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. I told myself the situation would stabilize. I told myself that loyalty and competence still mattered. But deep down, I felt the cracks widening. The quiet warnings piled up like pieces of a puzzle I wasn't ready to solve. And yet, I waited. The day Mark fired me was quiet, almost businesslike. He called me into his office without warning, no emails, no meetings beforehand, just a brief message to see him. When I arrived, Jenna was already there, sitting quietly in the corner. The atmosphere was oddly still. Mark didn't look upset or angry. His expression was flat, detached. He didn't bring up my work performance or any past issues. There were no complaints, no warnings, just a simple statement, "I'm letting you go." That was it. No details, no discussion, no mention of projects, deadlines, or company direction, no hints of dissatisfaction with my work, just a decision made to serve a purpose that had nothing to do with me or my contribution. I didn't argue. I didn't ask for reconsideration. There was no fight, no outburst. I simply nodded and gathered my things quietly. The office around us remained still, almost indifferent. No one else was in the room, no reactions, no sympathy, just the sound of my footsteps as I left. It was a betrayal stripped of drama. No shouting matches, no confrontations, just a cold, calculated move made for reasons outside the scope of professional judgment. In that moment, I understood that loyalty and years of hard work meant nothing. The decision was not about me or the company. It was about a personal show, a quiet gesture meant for someone else. I left without a word, carrying only the weight of that silent truth. I moved through the office slowly, methodically. My desk was the same as always, neatly arranged, a few personal items tucked into corners, the latest project files stacked in order. Now, it all felt foreign. The space seemed emptier, quieter than it had before. Every object carried the weight of routine and time I'd spent there. I packed my things with deliberate calm, a notebook, a pen, a few framed photos I'd brought in years ago. No rush, no lingering glances, just the steady act of gathering what was mine. The hum of computers and distant chatter in other parts of the building felt disconnected from me. As I cleared the desk, I thought about the projects left unfinished, the clients I'd been managing, the deadlines that still loomed. None of it mattered anymore. The work I'd poured myself into was now someone else's problem. Walking out, I passed colleagues who looked away or offered quiet nods, sympathy unspoken, awkward, distant. The corridor stretched longer than usual. The door clicked softly behind me. Outside, the world continued as if nothing had changed. There was no closure, no explanation beyond the brief words from Mark, no farewell meeting, no chance to say goodbye or make sense of it all. Just the stark reality of being cut loose without warning or reason I could contend. Uncertainty settled in. What now? How long before the next step? Could I even find one? Loss wasn't loud. It wasn't an outburst or a breakdown. It was a quiet space inside that echoed with absence, of security, of belonging, of something steady to hold on to. I didn't cry or shout. I didn't call anyone. I simply walked away, carrying a silence heavier than any words could hold. The days after I left the company blurred together, stretching into weeks and then months. At first, the silence was overwhelming, an absence so loud it filled every corner of my mind. But over time, that silence settled into something steadier, less chaotic. It became space for thought, for reflection, for recalibration. I didn't rush into anything. No calls demanding answers, no frantic job searches or attempts to reach Mark. The instinct to react sharply was there, but I pushed it aside. Instead, I watched and waited. I observed how the company moved on without me. I listened to what was said and what wasn't said in conversations with former colleagues. I followed the subtle shifts in leadership, the choices Mark made, the way Jenna's presence grew more obvious in official communications and company events. From a distance, I measured what I still held: knowledge of the company's inner workings, relationships with clients, understanding of the market, and an ability to anticipate problems before they surfaced. These weren't things anyone could take from me easily. They were quiet forms of leverage, the kind that don't demand confrontation, but can quietly shape outcomes. I allowed myself the space to feel what I needed to: disappointment, loss, frustration, but without letting those feelings dictate my next steps. Emotional distance wasn't about shutting down, it was about creating clarity, a way to look at the situation without being consumed by it. During those months, I developed a kind of mental inventory: what resources I had, what contacts I could reach out to, what weaknesses in the company I could identify. I wasn't planning revenge, I was planning leverage, not to strike in anger, but to shift the balance steadily over time. The world around me kept moving, but I stayed deliberate. I read reports on the company's financials, tracked new client acquisitions, and quietly reconnected with old contacts who still respected the work I'd done. I researched legal options, educated myself on shareholder rights, and mapped out possibilities that didn't rely on confrontation, but on patience and strategy. It was a process of quiet rebuilding, not of what was lost, but of what could be gained. The calm of this waiting was deceptive. It wasn't passive, it was preparation. I learned to sit with uncertainty without panic, to tolerate the unknown without losing focus. I realized that power often doesn't announce itself with noise or fury. Sometimes it grows in the quiet spaces left behind by those who underestimated it. By the time the first signs of change began to appear within the company, I was no longer reacting to loss. I was steering toward an outcome that felt inevitable because it was born of patience, clarity, and measured resolve. And through it all, I never needed to say a word. In the months following my departure, my focus shifted from loss to strategy. The quiet that had settled around me became a tool, a space to gather information, build connections, and identify leverage points that would eventually tip the balance in my favor. I started by digging into the company's financial health. Public records, industry reports, and insider chatter offered pieces of a larger puzzle. I noted the cash flow patterns, the client contracts up for renewal, and the debts quietly accumulating. What had once seemed like a stable operation was, from the outside, a different picture: fragile, overstretched, vulnerable in ways I had only glimpsed before. More importantly, I looked for weak points not just in numbers, but in relationships. Who among the clients felt neglected? Which investors were growing impatient? Where had Mark's decisions created tension or uncertainty? These weren't overt cracks, but subtle fractures, soft spots I could gently apply pressure to without raising alarms. Discretion was key. I reached out quietly, making calls and sending emails to trusted contacts I had built over the years, clients who valued my professionalism, investors who respected my insight, and industry insiders who understood the company's place in a shifting market. None of these conversations were confrontational or explicit. They were careful checks, gentle probes, conversations that kept doors open without signaling any immediate threat. At the same time, I began consulting legal and financial advisors to understand the mechanisms that might allow me to regain a stake in the company. I learned about shareholder rights, about ways to acquire shares without provoking conflict, about navigating corporate bylaws quietly and methodically. Every step was deliberate and measured. There was no rush, no desire to force the issue. I knew that overt moves would only alert Mark and Jenna, giving them time to build defenses. Instead, I worked in the shadows, assembling a strategy that relied on patience and precision. Every phone call, every email, every document reviewed was part of a larger plan. I tracked shareholder meetings from a distance, monitored the company's public statements, and stayed alert to any shifts in personnel or policy. I maintained a calm exterior, never revealing my intentions or impatience. This slow accumulation of influence was invisible to most. Mark continued making decisions as if nothing had changed, unaware that the ground beneath him was shifting. Jenna's role remained prominent, but fragile, her sway dependent on his support and the company's fragile state. My approach was indirect. I didn't confront or challenge. Instead, I leveraged relationships and information, building quiet pressure where it would matter most. I found allies among those who felt overlooked or dissatisfied, offering a listening ear and subtle reminders of what effective leadership looked like. This period of quiet preparation wasn't about vengeance. It was about reclaiming what had been taken through calculated, inevitable moves. It was about turning knowledge and relationships into real, tangible power, without fanfare or drama. I understood that real influence doesn't shout. It whispers and waits. It moves unseen until the moment it becomes impossible to ignore. And so I waited, built and positioned myself, patient, steady, controlled, ready for the moment when opportunity would meet preparation. When it did, it would speak louder than any confrontation ever could. The first tangible sign of change came quietly, almost imperceptibly. Over several months, I began acquiring small blocks of shares in the company. These weren't flashy moves, just quiet transactions with investors who had grown disillusioned or those seeking to reduce their stakes. None of it attracted attention. Each purchase was incremental and deliberate, a series of small claims laid without fanfare or notice. I kept my involvement invisible, never reaching out publicly or drawing eyes to the process. The nature of these acquisitions demanded patience and discretion. If I'd rushed or made sudden moves, it would have raised questions. Instead, I moved like a shadow, present but unseen, steady but unobtrusive. As my ownership grew, so did my influence, though it remained largely behind the scenes. I monitored board meetings, shareholder communications, and company memos with precision, looking for cracks in the leadership structure. Mark remained the face of the company, but the confident certainty I once admired in him began to waver. His decisions faltered under pressure, increasingly disconnected from the realities I'd known so well. In meetings, I noticed his voice sometimes lacked its usual conviction. His once sharp focus blurred into distracted glances or offhand remarks. Jenna's role, which had grown steadily over the past months, started to diminish. The team, sensing a shift in tides, quietly pulled away from her influence. This wasn't a sudden rebellion. There were no overt confrontations or dramatic resignations. Instead, the culture of the company changed subtly. Shifts in communication patterns, a return to established processes, and a growing confidence among managers who had previously been sidelined. I observed employees bypassing Jenna in email chains, opting instead to consult with others. Client requests began to focus on different points of contact. Managers who had hesitated before now pushed back gently on directives she had championed. This realignment wasn't noisy or aggressive. It was deliberate and silent, a reclamation of the culture I'd helped build. Meanwhile, Mark's mistakes accumulated. Deadlines slipped, messaging became inconsistent, and the company's performance faltered. Investors grew wary and client confidence dipped. Behind closed doors, conversations turned to concern and uncertainty. Throughout this period, I remained patient and measured. I didn't make public moves or broadcast my intentions. Instead, I leveraged my growing network to reassure clients and investors, strengthening relationships and building quiet support. My influence expanded not through confrontation, but through steady reliability and trust. Then came the turning point. At what seemed like an ordinary shareholder meeting, the balance of power shifted decisively. Days later, official notice arrived. I held the majority stake in the company, along with the authority to direct its future. The transition was devoid of drama. Mark acknowledged the change with a brief, resigned nod and stepped away without protest. Jenna's presence vanished quietly. No announcement, no farewell. The office breathed a collective, silent sigh of relief. Under my leadership, the company began to return to its core values: quiet competence, careful planning, and respect for the people who made the work possible. The culture I once knew reemerged slowly but surely, reinforced by clear direction and steady hands. The power I'd built over time spoke volumes without a word. No confrontation was necessary, no spectacle required. The outcome was inevitable, earned through patience, preparation, and quiet resolve. In the stillness that followed, the company belonged to me. Mark's departure was as quiet as everything else had been. There was no dramatic exit, no heated goodbyes or last-minute attempts to regain control. One morning, I arrived to find his office empty, his desk cleared. A brief note had been left for the staff announcing his resignation effective immediately. No explanations, no fanfare. Jenna disappeared shortly after. Her presence in the office, once so noticeable, faded into absence. She didn't attend meetings, stopped appearing in company events, and soon ceased all contact. The team barely remarked on it. It was as if the office had collectively accepted its exit without question. The atmosphere shifted. The tension that had lingered under Jenna's growing influence began to dissipate. People spoke more freely again, and collaboration felt natural rather than forced. Familiar faces returned to conversations, and new energy took root in the quieter hallways. There was no celebration, just a gradual return to a steadier, more predictable rhythm. Staff turnover increased slightly as some who had aligned themselves with the previous leadership moved on, but many stayed, reassured by the steady hand guiding the company now. I assumed leadership with calm resolve, aware of the work that lay ahead, but unmoved by the drama that had come before. My approach was deliberate, grounded in the same quiet dedication that had carried me through the years. The consequences of those months of change were real, but unspoken. No one needed to say what had been lost or gained. The shifts in power and loyalty played out in subtle ways: closed doors, hushed conversations, decisions made without public announcement. In this new chapter, the company moved forward not with loud declarations, but with steady progress. The fallout wasn't about blame or revenge. It was about the quiet, inevitable settling of scores that happens when control shifts beneath the surface. And through all it, I remained steady, the quiet force behind the company's next phase. No words were spoken when the final shift settled into place. No grand gestures marked the end, only the steady, silent truth of control passing from one hand to another. What began as quiet decisions and patient moves became an unspoken reality no one could deny. The company, once fractured by distractions and misplaced loyalties, found its course again under calm stewardship. In the stillness that followed, everything made sense, not because it was declared, but because it simply was. The outcome was neither sudden nor loud. It was inevitable. and it was complete.